In this video, we're going to look at live looping. Whilst in pattern mode, press Shift and F4 to switch live loops on. Bank D now becomes the live looper. If you had any sounds or patterns recorded on tracks D1 to D8, these will be muted, but they will still be remembered by the S2400. If you hit Shift and F4 again, the live looper will be deactivated, and any patterns and sounds on Bank D will be reactivated. If you hit Shift plus a live loops pad, you'll be greeted with that live loop's settings. Firstly, you can set the input jacks, lines 1 and 2, 3 and 4, phono 1 and 2, or USB. These are the jacks from which the live loop will record audio. The input jacks can be different for each live loop. If you want a reminder of input connections and input monitoring, please watch the previous video. Next, we have our input mix options. If the live loop is configured to stereo, the input mix will be stereo also, but if it is configured as mono, then the options are left, right, or left and right mixed as mono. Don't worry, I'll show you how to switch between stereo and mono in a moment. Next, we have our monitor options. Monitor input means that you can listen to the input signal whilst not recording. Note the main input monitor setting overrides live loop input monitoring. Secondly, we have monitor recording. This allows you to listen to the input signal whilst recording. This is not affected by the input monitor settings. Next, we can set the output from 1 to 8. Stereo live loops will play through output pairs as we've discussed previously, but as a reminder, outputs 1 or 2 means outputs 1 and 2, outputs 3 or 4 means outputs 3 and 4, etc. Next, we can set the divisions. 1 means the full length of the current pattern, and then 2 to 16 are divisions thereof. For example, 2 would be half of the length of the current pattern, and it would play twice. Below this, we can set the record mode. Latched means that this live loop will record when the pad is pressed and released, and it will stop recording when the pad is pressed and released for a second time. Momentary means that this live loop will record whilst the pad is held down, and it will stop when the pad is released. Fixed length means that the live loop will record for the length of the pattern. When the pad is pressed, recording will commence at the start of the pattern and end at the end, although you can manually end recording early by pressing the pad before the end of the pattern. Next, you can set the live loop's mute and solo behavior. That's whether it immediately mutes or solos when the buttons are pressed, or whether its state changes at the beginning of the next cycle. And you can also set its gain and filter mode. Below this is an option to save as sample once something is recorded, which we'll look at later as we haven't recorded anything yet. Below this is the live loop's configuration accordion, and this is where you can choose whether the live loop is mono or stereo. Note that mono live loops can be twice as long as stereo live loops, as mono live loops have 1 channel whilst stereo live loops have 2. Next, you can choose the number of banks. If this is set to 1, then just bank D is used. If you change this to 2, then both banks C and D are used and are muted, although their sounds and patterns are remembered, and the amount of live loop time available doubles. Below this, you can choose how many live loops you need. Now, to explain this further, like a computer, the S2400 has a fixed amount of memory, which has to be shared by the processes that are in use. Stereo files have 2 channels, left and right, and each live loop requires memory. Therefore, if you use 8 stereo live loops on bank D only, there is enough memory for each live loop to have 9.7 seconds of recording time. Conversely, if bank C is muted and its memory is borrowed for the live loops are switched to mono, meaning that there's only 1 channel instead of 2, and the number of live loops is reduced from 8 down to 1, that live loop will have 174.7 seconds of recording time available. So editing the number of banks, the number of live loops, and whether they're mono or stereo is how you buy yourself the amount of time you need for your recording at its given tempo. If you've made changes, you'll need to enact those using the reconfigure option at the bottom. If there's nothing changed, then this option will be unavailable. In use, a pattern must be playing in order to use the live looper, although the pattern could be empty and you could monitor the metronome for timing. To select the live loop track that you want to record to, just press it. I've set my record mode to fixed length, and so if I press it a second time, we'll start recording at the beginning of the next repeat and automatically end at the end of the pattern. Initially, the B button illuminates and the looper records into a temporary memory buffer, the length of which depends upon what we discussed earlier. If you don't like what you've recorded or you make a mistake, just hit B on the active live loop track and it's removed from the record buffer. If you do want to keep your performance, hit A and it will be merged into what we call the active live loop. You can then hit the same pad again, record more into the buffer, and then hit A to merge the second pass into the same live loop. Or you can move over to the next live looper track and start something new. You can, of course, switch tracks on the fly in real time. If you want to wipe a live loop entirely, hit Erase and then the pad for that live loop, and then Confirm. Once a live loop has something recorded into it and it's been merged with the A button, you can hit Shift and the pad and choose the Save as Sample option to save the sample to a project or folder and assign it to a track. There is also a handy option to clear the live loop and add the relevant pattern event or events to the destination track, so that the live loop is not only copied to a new track as a sample, but it will be triggered correctly without you needing to record that into the pattern. You can, of course, then play with level, pitch, envelopes, loop slice, multi-mode, record override, step program, etc. In terms of live loop performance, the filter and resonance can be tweaked in real time per track, the faders adjust the levels, and the mute and solo buttons can be used. Their immediacy behavior per loop is set in the live loop settings menu that we discussed earlier, but if you press Shift and either mute or solo, then you get the opposite result as was in the live loop settings for that loop. Solo will always override mute, but multiple live loops can be soloed. And so that's live looping.